Hi, this is Steve Warona, and you are listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's speaker, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. Now, there's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of this box, and that's the tab you'll use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speaker. We'll be breaking for questions several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. You can also send direct messages to a specific person by hovering your cursor over a name in the attendee list. And one of those names is Technical Help, and that's the place to go if you run into technical problems. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSwebinar. That's NCCPSwebinar. If you missed part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded and captioned. The link will be available shortly after the webinar on the NCCPS Webinars page. And watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's session. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now for our presentation. Along with death and taxes, one more certainty is emergencies. They will arise. Business continuity plans help minimize the negative effects of an emergency incident and expedite the restoration of functions. And yet surveys show that only 36% of institutions of higher education currently have business continuity plans in place. Today we'll hear from Krista M. Dillon about the definition, benefits, and basics of continuity planning in higher education. Krista is Director of Operations for Safety and Risk Services at the University of Oregon. In this role, she manages the emergency management and fire prevention programs, as well as a number of interdepartmental teams, including the Incident Management Team, Campus Vulnerability Assessment Team, Behavioral Evaluation and Threat Assessment Team, and Communications and Emergency Response Center Advisory Committees. Krista is also the current chair of the International Association of Emergency Managers, University and Colleges Caucus. Prior to working in Safety and Risk Services, Krista served as the Associate Director for the Oregon Partnership for Disaster Resilience at the University of Oregon's Community Service Center, where she focused on assisting cities and counties develop natural hazard mitigation plans and on providing technical assistance on post-disaster recovery issues. She has a master's degree in community and regional planning from the University of Oregon. Krista Dillon, welcome to Campus Public Safety Online.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about, first, the sort of basics of business continuity, why it's important, some of the steps, and I think the thing that's going to be maybe most of interest are some examples of the ways that we've implemented continuity during some disruptions and emergencies here at the University of Oregon. To start off, I like to put business continuity in context. As an emergency management program, we do all of these things you see here. The first step is really a vulnerability assessment to determine what are those bad things that can come up on your campuses. From there, we typically develop our response plans or our emergency operations plans, which for the most part, most campuses have. And then as Steve mentioned, the statistics about business continuity, only about a third of our campuses have business continuity plans for their campus to address disruptions and how we continue important services. There are also mitigation plans, which look at what we can do before the bad thing happens to make the impact less on our campus, and then also on recovery frameworks. So if we were to have a major catastrophic impact, how are we going to rebuild from that? And then all of those things require training and exercising. And I'm sure, as all of you know, and you can see from the statistics, business continuity can be hard to implement on a campus for a number of reasons. It's not as exciting as response. You know, the media doesn't want to show up to hear how you were able to process payroll during a power outage because you had a continuity plan. They like to see, you know, people getting rescued and fires and things that are more exciting to watch on the news. But from an emergency management standpoint, all of these components are equally important, and we do need to spend time on all of them. So hopefully today you'll gain some insights about how you may be able to move your programs forward or get them started if you don't have them. a little bit more background on continuity. This is what we like to share with our departments, is that really the goal for us is that we want to be able to do tomorrow what we were doing yesterday, no matter what happens today. And that's a quote from Paul Diamond, who developed the Koali product that some of you may be familiar with. So why is business continuity important? We all have lots of things going on in our day job. We don't have a lot of time to focus on it, but there are a number of reasons why it's important to your campuses and to your programs. Number one, it can help protect your people and your property. The second one is, again, it can help resume critical operations and work processes. So when we go into response mode to put out a fire or deal with a communicable disease, we still have other critical business functions to take care of, and this planning process will help you be able to do the response piece, but then also get your normal work up and running. And unlike a large business like Intel or Microsoft or departments or businesses that are making things, our services are really about teaching, research, and service. So how do we get back to doing those core things when we've had any sort of disruption? Another really important piece for us, given our academic calendars, is that we want to minimize downtime. And here I'm using sort of the standard business language of clients and customers, but really it's our students. We can't afford, especially the University of Oregon's on quarters, so we have 10-week academic terms. We can't afford to lose an entire week to winter weather or some other sort of disruption, because that impacts our ability for our students to continue their academic progress. It could have impacts on financial aid and other big picture items through the Department of Education. So we really want to try and make sure that we're able to, especially on the teaching and research side, continue those things, because there are some implications if those stop on our campuses. Again, direct damage is only one factor. We may have something that's not even on our campus that causes an impact to our campus, and we may be highly dependent on external environments. One of the things that we're looking at right now, the University of Oregon is highly dependent on tuition from a financial standpoint, and so we're looking at tuition increases where a neighboring public schools or public university system just implemented tuition freezes. So because our tuition, we rely on tuition dollars to fund a majority of our activities on campus, a neighboring state system freezing their tuition, that may have some implications for us. And so that's actually a business continuity thing we may need to look at here on our campus. There may be other examples of how your campus is connected to your community or your region or state that, again, make business continuity really important, not just for you, but for the communities that your campuses are located in. Business continuity is also important, thinking about the supplies and the goods that we need as universities. So I like to use we are a residential campus. We have housing and dining services, but we rely on trucks coming to campus. And if those trucks aren't coming every day, we don't have a large warehouse of food stockpiled somewhere. And so we could have an impact somewhere completely outside of Eugene, Oregon, but if our transportation system is impacted, then all of a sudden we need to implement a continuity plan for feeding of our students here on campus. Again, I mentioned it's not just for catastrophic losses. I think sometimes maybe our leadership thinks about business continuity from the big bad things, the hurricane, the earthquake, lots of really big things. But in reality, we are actually likely implementing business continuity on a daily basis. The joke in our office is, what happens if one of us gets hit by a bus? But what happens if one of us gets hit by a bus? We may need to come up with our continuity plan if all of a sudden one of our staff members needs an unplanned illness and they're out for 2 months. How do we fulfill the services that that person does when they're out? You may have planned or unplanned relocation for departments where they all of a sudden need to move to a different location. What do they need in order to do their jobs every day? So that may be something, again, it may not be an emergency or a disaster, but you may need to relocate people, which would require you to implement your continuity plan. We have kind of a funny example here on campus, and this is why I have the indoor air quality issue listed. We actually had a rat die in a wall and caused a smell in an office, and we had to relocate a couple of people while we took care of that issue. So again, it's very minor. Someone was disrupted for a couple of days, but they had to implement a mini continuity plan to say, how do we take this payroll person? Can we just give them a laptop and stick them in the conference room and continue to do their work? That's business continuity. Another really a good example, and one that we've seen several times, is utility disruption. So power outages, utility outages on campus. How do you continue your teaching, research, and service if your steam system goes down for 6 hours? What are the critical functions that rely on steam? Do you have people and animals that need that for heating and cooling? You know, those types of things can cause impacts on your campus. Again, it's not just what happens to us here on campus, but something could happen really far away that may impact your operations as well. I know several years ago there was a huge monsoon over in Asia where all of the toner manufacturers were, and there was some concern that we may, because of this impact in Asia, we may be, as businesses needing toner to put in our printers, we may have been impacted. It ended up not being like that. But sort of thinking about your risk assessment for not just things happening on your campus, but what are the things in your community or your region that you rely on in order to do your job. Business continuity may also come into play if you were to have a reputational impact, something in the news that is not good for your campus. Again, thinking from a tuition dependency standpoint like we do, if we were to have something that, we were all over the Wall Street Journal and all of a sudden students didn't want to come to the University of Oregon, well, now we have some continuity that we have to put into place because we may have some financial impacts. And there's a whole host of other reasons why continuity might be important. And then again, as always, there's this ever-growing expectation for continued service. I know I was experiencing this yesterday at home trying to watch the Duck women basketball game, and my internet was flickering, and I wasn't able to catch moments of the game, and so I was wishing that my local internet provider had a better continuity plan in that moment. But there is this expectation from students and parents and our other constituents that we are able to take care of our students and that we're able to provide our normal services that they're paying for on a daily basis. And so that's another really important reason why we want to make sure that we have these plans in place, or we're thinking about how we'd go about that. This graphic just kind of shows you the timeline. Again, when we have that bad day there at the lightning strike, initially we're going to be in response mode to make sure that we're taking care of life safety issues. But we really want to start thinking about continuity as soon as possible. And so, thinking about the teams that you have, usually we have limited numbers of staff, and we are so focused on response that sometimes we wait to implement the continuity. And what we really want to think about is, can you train up your team so that you've got your folks who are out dealing with the problem, but then your other team is sort of sitting in the wings thinking about continuity, because that process, depending on how big the impact is and how long that lasts, you may be implementing your continuity plans for several weeks after an incident that maybe was just a couple of hours long. And when we talk about some of the examples at the end of the session, you'll kind of get that idea for how long this window of continuity can last after an impact. So in terms of characteristics of business continuity, there are some things that are predetermined and static, things like your essential functions. What are the services that your department or that your campus as a whole provides? Oftentimes those functions will require vital records or documents and data that you need to think about where it's stored, how it's stored. Another really important piece is succession and delegated authority. So within departments and within the university as a whole, is there a clear chain of command so that if your president is on some sort of meeting out of the country, who's the next in line to be able to make decisions around continuity, and having that same thing identified for your departments who are developing plans as well. The last one, continuity facilities. This one's tricky for us. Space is at a premium on our campus. I'm sure some of you have this as well. We don't just have a warehouse across town that we could move functions to. And so this one for us is something that happens on the fly. That may be the same for you, maybe not. When you look at sort of the FEMA standard planning, you know, they all talk about their devolution sites where the federal agencies will physically pick up and move to other locations, and that's a little bit trickier for us as higher ed, but something to think about as well. In addition to the things that are sort of set and static, there are also very dynamic things around business continuity that require some situational management. Again, resource conflicts. When something happens, we may not have all the resources that we need for a given function, so we're going to have to kind of determine in the moment what we need and what's most critical and what gets those resources. Again, thinking about succession and delegation, these things always happen when key folks are gone, it seems like. Again, limits to continuity facilities. So if you're dealing with a large-scale hurricane or a large earthquake where you're among hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations that are impacted, being able to move somewhere else may be tricky because other places might also be impacted. And then also thinking about communications, in that continuity is very easy if we have lights and power in our buildings, but if we're talking about a catastrophic impact to some of our critical systems and those aren't working, now we have to figure out how to make continuity work when we can't call people on our cell phones or connect with them via our networks. And so I think
Krista,
we're ready to take a break. Sure.
Yes, we are. Krista, thanks very much. You're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Our topic today is business continuity, and our speaker is Krista Dillon from the University of Oregon. If you have questions or comments for Krista, type them into that line at the bottom of the questions and comments pod on the left side of your screen. We've got several breaks planned before the end of the webinar. Don't wait until the end to ask your questions. Krista, your rat in the wall example intrigues me. I'm guessing that when the room first started smelling and nobody knew really what was going on, for one thing, you had no idea how long the disruption was going to be. How do you deal with a situation like that where you just have no idea how long you're going to be disrupted?
I think, you know, part of that is gathering your situational awareness, and that because it was an uncomfortable workspace for that person, we moved them to a temporary spot as those investigations were happening. And then, you know, within a day or two, we figured out what the issue was and knew that it wasn't a long-term issue. But I think that's part of it, is just always trying to gather as much information as you can about the situation so that you can make those decisions. Sometimes you kind of have to jump in and choose a path not having all of that information. In this case, it was a very small scale issue. The person could easily do their work on a laptop as long as they were connected to wireless in a conference room. And so it was a little bit easier versus, you know, something that's much more complicated where you don't really know where the end is going to be, and that if they had to work in the conference room for a year, that probably wasn't going to be the most comfortable or ergonomic choice for that person. So I think it's about having the right communication channels to get information to assess the situation that you're in.
Tremendous, thanks. Somebody wonders, where do you start if you have no resources or the issue is not on your leader's radar?
Sure. I think that this is a common problem for folks. I think one would be start with your own program and develop a continuity plan for your public safety department, if that's where you're from, or environmental health and safety, so that you can show people what it looks like and what the steps are. I think the other thing that can be helpful is when you look at the resources and the tools that are out there, it can be a tremendous task to go through and identify all of your functions. And if you do a full plan, you're basically asking, you know, a dozen or 20 questions about each of the functions that you have. One of the approaches that we take is just to start small. Just brainstorm your functions. And if that's all you can do, then at least you know what the things are, and when the bad day happens, you can prioritize within that list. And so that's been pretty effective for us, is that we're not going in and asking departments to develop this big, giant continuity plan at once. We try and do it in baby steps. Tell us what your functions are. think about when those things in the year are most critical, and that is typically doable for some departments. And so that may be a good strategy to kind of jump in if you don't have that buy-in or you don't have the resources.
Let me squeeze in one more question during this break. G. Scott Anderson wonders, what templates do you recommend that apply best to higher education?
Sure. So there are some, and I'm not going to endorse products, but there are, software tools that you can purchase. FEMA does have some stuff, though it doesn't really have a higher education bend to it. There is a group called the Institute for Business and Home Safety, and they have developed a very simple tool. It was aimed at small businesses. And that one, if you're getting started, is pretty simple. Again, it's just what are your functions, and then ask some basic questions around it. The other thing is that there are, if you're not familiar with it, we have what's called the Disaster Resilient Universities listserv, which is an open listserv for higher ed around emergency management. And that, I can't remember how many people we're up to, something like 900 institutions across the country. But that's a great resource to be able to poll people. A lot of campuses have developed, their own systems. And so I think there's a lot of resources out there that you can look at and sort of pick and choose based on your campus needs.
Thanks, Krista. Let's let you get back to your presentation, moving on to slide 11.
Okay. So I'm going to move into more around the business continuity steps that you want to think about as you get started. And again, depending on your resources and your time and your leadership, you can do all of these things. You can pick and choose. But really the first thing to do when you're talking about business continuity is to assess your functions. And so what we ask our folks to do, and what we did, was simply got some Post-it notes, and we wrote all the services and functions that our emergency management program did, and we stuck them up on the wall so that we knew what the different things were. And then from there, for each function, you want to go in and describe what it is, so that if someone has to sort of step into that and do it, and they don't do it as their normal day job, they understand what it is. You want to identify the process and procedures. Ideally, in everything that we do, there would be this handy, laminated sheet that gave you the process and procedures for implementing, your active shooter training program, or monitoring and updating your emergency operations plan. If you've got that stuff together, it makes it really easy, because then if I get hit by a bus, my colleague can step in, grab the binder about that function, and know exactly what to do. The other thing to think about is utilities. Do you require power? Do you require access to your servers? Do you require steam and chilled water? This really comes into play in the research world for a lot of us, that yes, I need power because I need my computer to work, but thinking about the criticality of some of your research functions, we tend to have highly sensitive equipment that doesn't like to get power outages or even bumps in power. You may have animal research facilities that need to keep their HVAC systems up and running and may require temperature regulations and things like that. So this becomes a critical question when you start to deal with your research areas, if you've got those. And then you also want to identify what supplies and equipment that you need to fulfill that function. So again, it's easy in my job and the work that I do to have a laptop. As long as I have power and internet, I can do my work. But if I'm a researcher in our material science program, I need more than just a laptop and power. I need my, fancy radiation equipment to be working. And so those questions can be helpful, especially on the research side, because it's going to be more difficult just to up and move them somewhere else without their equipment. And then also thinking about programs and data. So this is mainly software programs. A lot of us have, especially folks in academic advising and the registrar, you have your sort of student data systems, and depending on what your security requirements are, I know for us, very few people have access to that from home. You need to be on campus, which is good from a security standpoint, but creates some issues from a continuity standpoint, that those people can't simply work from home because they can't access our student data when they're not on our networks. So thinking through what those those data and systems requirements are. Again, thinking about the people and the training, sometimes we have positions that as long as you had a warm body, you could stick them in there and they could take over that function. But sometimes we have positions that require very specific training. Research is like that. If you have a child care center on campus, you want to make sure that if you're sticking new staff in there that they have background checks and those types of things. You may have a function that has a relationship with vendors or third parties and thinking about what those relationships are and identifying those. Interdependencies is really important as well. So thinking about if I'm doing payroll in our central business affairs office, I require inputs from every department. Every department does time entry. That comes to me as central payroll, and I do that. And then if you have maybe you have a third-party contractor who actually issues the checks. So there's a workflow that involves more than just your department. You want to think about all of those workflows as you're going through this particular function. And then lastly, thinking about things like peak load or the cycle in which that function is more or less critical. The example we like to give is that if we are processing payroll, if we processed payroll on Monday and the bad thing happens today, then payroll is not a critical function because we did it and we're fine as long as we can get back up and running in the next month. But if it's Tuesday and I have to process payroll on Wednesday, well then payroll becomes critical. So we also ask our departments to think about the times of year or times of the week or times of the month when their functions are more critical than other times. And that can help you do a really quick assessment when you have something happen. The next piece, once you've kind of identified the things that you do and what you need, you want to look at the impact. So what would happen if you couldn't do that function or a task? Do you start to have negative impacts at just a day? Could you go a week? Could you go a month without doing that particular function? And the ways to think about that are, is there a health and safety or a life safety issue if we're not doing this particular thing? So if we all of a sudden had some sort of impact to our campus police department, well, that may have some impacts on life and safety. We don't have our first responders. So we probably can't afford to not have that function for more than a day. You may have contractual or financial obligations to do something. And so then you start to see those impacts within a certain time frame. Again, reputational impacts, these sort of things that happen where you get into the news, or maybe you have a reputational impact because you're not doing something. If your janitorial staff in your residence hall goes on strike and now you've got students living in residence halls that haven't been cleaned in a week, you're probably going to start to see some reputational impact from parents being upset about something like that. There may also be a funding implication. So if you have a function that generates revenue and you're not doing that, you're all of a sudden losing revenue stream. Or in some cases, on a regulatory standpoint, if we don't do certain things from a research standpoint or financial, we may have a fine or a penalty that we have to pay. So thinking about, how bad of a day is it going to be when something like this happens? And to help our departments, we kind of ask them to think about things in these 3 different buckets. Something that needs to be happening within the first 12 hours, that's critical. We need to make sure that we have a plan in place for how to maintain those services, even if it's at a diminished capacity. Then we think about things that are kind of okay in that 1 day to 1 month range. And again, maybe it's at a limited capacity. We can't process as much, or maybe it's only 1 staff person who's doing it instead of 3, but we need to kind of keep those things going. And then everything else kind of falls into a recover as needed category. And I'll tell you just a little anecdote that's related to one of the examples I'll talk about later, but we've had a couple of times where we've needed to on the fly get some feedback about critical functions. And the tricky thing is everyone thinks everything that they do falls into this first bucket, and so we would get information back, like an academic department's newsletter. Well, gosh, it's critical. We have to absolutely do that. But part of what our job is looking in the grand scheme of things, our power plant is critical. We need to make sure our power plant is working because everybody else on campus needs that to work. But your department newsletter, while it is important, that thing probably falls into the recover as needed category. And so this is just the sort of time scheme that we've developed that we use with our departments on campus, but that can kind of help people place those functions into priority levels. And again, we want to think about what's called maximum allowable downtime, and that is how long can you go before things really get tricky with this particular function. So the key is you want to have this conversation and this question about each of your functions because they may be different. You want to think about how much is needed to stay somewhat functional. So in some cases, we may need that function to function at 100% even in that first 12 hours. And in other cases, we may be able to say, well, it's okay if it's at a limited function where normally we can process 500 of these forms in a day. Well, we're only going to be able to process 100 forms in the day, but that's okay with us. And then thinking about how long can you go until you can't recover from that. And I think one of the things that we as higher ed deal with here is on the academic side. How long could we go before we lose a term? And what does that mean? Would we need to, at what point would we need to think about giving tuition reimbursements and situations like that? Those are the types of things when we start to talk about academic continuity on campus that we haven't really answered those questions, but it's an important part of the process. And then lastly, the thing we want to talk about is coping strategies. So there are things that we can do before the disruption that can really help us. And what we found to be helpful when we started doing continuity, people wanted to talk about scenarios. Well, what's our continuity plan if it floods? What's our continuity plan if we have a pandemic illness? And we found that that wasn't helpful because when you're talking about flooding, people all of a sudden said, well, is it an inch of water or is it a foot of water? Is it standing water or is it running water? Because all of those have different impacts. And so we simplify it and say, what are our coping strategies if we don't have our people? So that could be a strike for employees. It could be a pandemic illness. It could be a whole host of things. But what do we do if we are short on staff? And then the second one is, what if we don't have our building or our space? How can we do this function physically somewhere else on campus? It doesn't matter what it is that caused us to have to move, but how do we move on from there? And then the third question is what if we don't have our inputs? So the stuff that we need on a daily basis, whether that's data or our networks or it's food coming in trucks to our residence halls, what do we do if we don't have that stuff? How can we overcome that? And then the one thing that we really try and emphasize, because sometimes business continuity can make it seem to an employee like if none of their functions that they do fall into those critical high priority categories, we really want to be careful. And our motto is that there are no non-essential staff. Everyone's important because we're going to put you to work. We're going to find something for you to do, but some of our functions are things that can be deferred to a later point.
Thanks, Krista. We can take some questions. Now, let me tie up a loose end in the meantime. Those of you who haven't been reading along in the chat, let me note that Krista is mentioning a couple of URLs, and we will capture those links. Thank you, Justin Stewart, for typing some of them into the chat room. We'll capture those links and put them on the NCCPS webpage for this webinar, so we will not lose any of those links. Krista, Jennifer Boucher wonders, do you suggest that your emergency op plan combine with your COOP plan or keep them separated?
I think that's a choice. I've mostly seen them be two separate things. But if you think back to that sort of pie graph that I had early on, both your emergency operations plan or your response plan and your continuity plan or your COOP plan, they both require that vulnerability assessment. And so it would be easy to tie those two things together to say, here are the bad things that could happen, here's how we're going to respond to them, and then here's how we're going to keep our operations going if any of those things happen. So I think it's just a choice for your program. Ours are separated at the University of Oregon. The thing that I've actually found and where I think business continuity is the most helpful is that if you do it and you've identified your functions and you know the priorities, your continuity plan can actually help you become a tool for response. So if we have a power outage and something happens, we can look to our critical functions that require power and very quickly know, here's where we need to put our resources around response. And so I think for that reason, there is a really close nexus, and so making the choice to put those together in the same plan also makes sense.
How in-depth and or detailed are the BCP plans developed by the University of Oregon? What level of detail is needed for a reasonably good plan?
So we are, how would I describe our program? I think we're in a rebuilding phase right now. We started off and we had an in-house tool that was just Word and Excel files, and then we purchased an off-the-shelf product, and then due to budget cuts had to not have that anymore, and so we are rebuilding a web-based tool on campus, and so our plans are in varying stages, from departments who have simply listed what their critical functions are, all the way up to we have this one particular research facility that's really bought into continuity, and we developed a pilot. They were part of a pilot project when we very first started about 6 years ago, and they developed a plan, and every year I get an update from them without prompting. And so again, to me, because I know that we all have limited resources, if a department has simply listed their functions and talked about the criticality of each of those, we can help them, and that's a benefit. And so ideally it would be great if everyone in every department had answered all of the questions on the slides that we just talked about, but sort of the reality check for us is, have people thought about what they've done, what they do, and how critical those things are, so that when something happens, we can come and help them. So I know that's kind of like a wishy-washy answer, but it kind of depends on the resources that are available and what your standards are. I know that there are other campuses that are much farther along than us and have a lot more plans than we do. So it just kind of depends, again, on your resources and what your leadership's expectations are for those plans.
Squeezing one more into this break, I would like to hear about the review process of this. Annual, every other year, other?
So in our the nice thing that we're building this new online, it's going to have an automatic reminder at a 1-year point. And so that's going to be our model moving forward, is that once a plan is submitted, our emergency management office will review it when it's first complete and give some feedback to the department. And then every year on an annual basis, we'll do a check back in with them. And so that the nice part is that it's all going to be automated through the system, and that we don't have to sort of track by putting email calendars in. But that's our plan, is to check in once a year with departments who have plans.
Thanks, Krista. Keep those questions coming. We've got one more break at the end, but in the meantime, we'll let you get back to your presentation.
All right, so I'm going to talk now about some examples of when we've implemented continuity here at the University of Oregon. The first example was we have an animal research facility, and they actually, they don't do the research themselves, but they grow zebrafish, basically. So any researcher across the globe, basically, who does research with zebrafish, they probably bought it from our facility here on campus. So they had a fire in this little tiny room, 6 foot by 10 foot-ish. This is what it looked like before. This is what it looked like afterwards. The interesting piece here is that this fire was completely contained to this small room, but the HVAC system did not work properly, so it should have shut down the HVAC once the sprinkler, or not the sprinkler system, but once the fire started, and that didn't happen. So it actually pulled soot and smoke throughout the entire facility, which caused them to have to, actually I think I have this on the next slide, they had to completely move out of their space. They had to basically throw away anything that wasn't metal. They had the fabric lined cubicle walls, furniture, paper. We were only able to save their sort of heavy pieces of equipment that could be specially cleaned. They were displaced from their building for a year in a portable trailer and a Quonset hut outside. They had a potential business interruption claim for about $250,000 because, again, they're a service center, so they are generating revenue by selling these zebrafish specimens to researchers around the country. One of the interesting things was that their normal everyday business processes, when they all were physically located next to each other in cubicles, now all of a sudden you broke up the staff and they were in two separate places. So the actual sort of day-to-day business process slowed down. They had to lay off some student workers in the immediate cleanup efforts, but they had a continuity plan. This is actually the group that I mentioned earlier, and they had developed a plan. They knew down to, like, if we ever had lost water, that they knew exactly, we're going to feed the fish less because then their tanks don't get dirty as quickly, and then we don't have to refill the water as much. I mean, they had gone into absolute detail about the animal care side of things, and that was huge for them. And so it made this, even though, these bullets that you see here seem like a really huge impact, and it wasn't as bad because they had a plan. The one saving grace was that none of the fish stock, I mean, I don't have a photo of it, but they have this big fish room with rows and rows and rows and tanks, hundreds and probably thousands of tanks of fish. And we didn't know immediately if that smoke and soot had impacted those fish to make them viable. That would have been a huge loss. But they were able to, after about 2 weeks or so, be able to determine that those fish were still fine and that they could continue their business operations. One of the really interesting things about this particular lesson learned is that when we think about what, how critical functions are, this particular impact was devastating to this department, but for the U of O as a whole, it wasn't that big of a deal, but it caused ripple effects all across the globe, basically, because we had researchers, PhD students in Australia calling in tears because they were about to finish their dissertation, but they needed this sample that we couldn't ship because we had had this impact. So it was a really interesting example because while it wasn't a huge devastating impact to the University of Oregon, it did create these ripple waves across the country. So thinking about what those researchers at other institutions, did they have a continuity plan if their inputs, our fish, were impacted? But we like to tout that even though they had a bad day, it wasn't as bad as it could have been because they had that plan. The next example, we have our graduate teaching students went on strike during the fall of 2014 during finals week. And so we found ourselves in a situation of having to, how do we put on and make sure that finals can happen? So one of the things we had to quickly do was determine what critical functions those graduate students performed. And what we found was they had a big role in grading exams, in proctoring exams, and in some cases, our graduate students were the sole instructor of a course. So they were responsible for the content, the exam development, the proctoring, and grading. So we did not have any academic continuity plans going into this particular incident, but we developed a process on the fly to be able gather this information. And what we did is we basically worked with our largest college, the College of Arts and Sciences. They have about 49 academic programs, and we pulled some data. We said, here are all the classes that this is the Chinese languages program. Here are all the classes that you teach. Tell us which ones of these have GTF, graduate teachers. And what do they do? Are they grading? Are they responsible for the whole course? So you see these red dots and yellow dots. We were able to prioritize the courses to say this one is a sole instructor GTF. So we have to somehow figure out how to give a grade in a class where the GTF might not show up. And so this was a very labor-intensive process. We started in August, and they didn't go on strike till December. And this was a full-time gig, basically, for our office in working with the college to determine where we may have some gaps and what we were going to do about it. And so some of the coping strategies that we came up with is, one, some general things. We didn't want to have a situation where students showed up for either dead week or an exam and not have anyone in the classroom. So we actually offered opportunities to staff. They got paid $25 a pop to go and be a greeter at a classroom. So they had an assigned classroom. If no one was in there, they would say, hello, we're very sorry. Please contact your department head if you have any questions. Or if someone was there, they just marked that. We also had volunteer staff proctoring exams. And then we had a host of academic continuity options. The first was that we extended our grading deadline in hopes that if the graduate students came back in time, we gave them an extra, I think we were able to extend it an extra week before grades were due to the registrar. We allowed departments to cancel course hours in dead weeks that weren't tied to exams. We allowed them to modify final exams to expedite grading. There should be an asterisk here to make sure one of the key things was that we couldn't compromise academic integrity, so it still needed to be a rigorous exam commensurate with what it should have been, but we just wanted to try and make it easier to grade. Department heads could allow their faculty members to forego a final and let students take the existing grades that they had going into finals week. In some cases, you had exams that were worth a huge percentage of the grade, and students who had performed not well early on were hoping that their final was going to help boost their grade, so that one was a little bit tricky in some places. And then we also departments could hire temporary staff to help grade. And so this was, again, we didn't have any academic continuity plans in place, but these options, these academic options that you see here are likely what we would be looking at for other types of academic disruption. So what we did is each individual department didn't necessarily have a plan, but we came up with some broad strategies that the provost could implement, or a dean could implement, or a department head could implement. And so we would likely use these same thoughts and coping strategies moving forward for further events. The next example I want to talk about is the Umpqua Community College shooting. So they are located about an hour south of us, and we sent a group of our incident management team down. And so out of our experience there, my boss, who's Andre Leduc, developed this graphic kind of talking about these waves and how response overlaps with continuity, overlaps with recovery. So we went down not at all around the first responder pieces of law enforcement. All of that stuff was taken care of. But we got there really to kind of help with this transition from response to continuity. So we were there about 20 hours after the incident, and we were working with their leadership team to get a situation assessment to figure out what it was that needed to happen. And some of the key business continuity activities that needed to happen was payroll was due that next week. So they decided to close campus to classes, but they had some critical business functions that needed to happen. And so payroll was one of those things. They also hadn't distributed financial aid yet, and that was a critical function for them because they knew so many of their students relied on their financial aid dollars to help pay rent and childcare expenses. And so we needed to figure out a way to support the financial aid staff who needed to come into work after this terrible incident had happened on their campus. And what we did was we paired them up. We brought other community college staff from other colleges around the state who are familiar with the same systems and processes, just to be there to help that person go through those sort of standard actions that they normally would after this event. But some of again, they didn't have a continuity plan, but we were able to quickly assess the situation, figure out what was critical, and help get them some resources to implement those things. You see some of the questions that we asked, again, financial tipping points around events, when would other activities resume on campus, looking at continuing security services, and then impact assessments for their IT systems. So that, again, was an example of we went in and very quickly developed and implemented a continuity plan without having something existed as well. So I think, someone asked the question earlier about how do you do this when you don't have leadership. Take advantage of disruptions and incidents that happen to use that as a springboard to develop your continuity plans. We also have hosted the U.S. Olympic track and field trials for the last 3 years, and we do put together a continuity program on campus because despite the fact that we have this huge sporting event, it's still happening during our summer session. We have other camps and conferences and events and other normal businesses happening. So what we try and do is get a good assessment of what the on-campus and off-campus events are, make sure that our departments know how to report any impacts that they may have during that particular event, because our number one goal is still teaching research and service even when we have these large events happening. So with that, I think I'd be happy to take more questions.
Tremendous, thanks, and we do have several here. Rich wonders, how much of the plan is your department writing, or are the other departments writing their portion of the plan and you're integrating their inputs into the larger plan?
So the way that we have developed our plan is that there really isn't a larger plan other than having a succession line for our leadership, and then each individual department has a plan, and they actually write all of those components. Our job is just to help review those pieces and ask questions, and mainly help them put their functions into the appropriate buckets of, is this function something that's enterprise essential that everybody else needs you to do in order for them to do their job, or is it department essential? So we don't actually have an umbrella plan other than having sort of those big picture delegation of authority pieces.
Carol Prescott wonders about exercises for the COOPs. Do you have exercises? Have you completed any type of exercise for any of your COOPs?
I think that, we've had some really small-scale sort of tabletop exercises. We've done that with housing, where we kind of say, what would we do if this happened? So it wasn't a very structured exercise, but just giving them a scenario of, you have power out and you don't think you're going to get it back for 48 hours. What are you doing in your residence halls? So we have done some of that, but it's been really low-key tabletop exercises that didn't take a lot of build-up or prep to put together.
From Peter McCann, is the web-based COOP portal you're building a CMS or HTML type system or built from scratch type website?
Ooh, that is a very technical question. It is, I think it's HTML. So we have, the way that we're building it, we actually have a campus GIS department where we have mapped buildings and rooms, down to the cable plug. They know, the number of the cable plug in each room. And so we've actually tied our continuity plan to that system so that when I log into it, it already knows who I am, what department I'm associated with, and what spaces I'm associated with. So it's cutting down on some of the data entry that departments would typically have to say about who their staff is. And so then all they have to do is enter the functions, and they can actually tie it to space. So a map comes up, and I can say that this function of emergency management lives in this particular room in this building. But I'm just not tech savvy enough to know what it's built on. But we did actually we started down this path with the University of Georgia has developed their own homegrown system that I think is HTML based, and they're willing to share the coding for that. And so that may be a good resource to look for and a good starting place. And that's kind of what started our efforts down the road that we're on now.
From Ruth Mitchell, does your institution have a policy requiring units and departments to develop and maintain a BCP? And if so, how is that policy operationalized?
We do not have a policy. I think what we've been focused on is that we've tried to say internally within our department that if you're we have some what we call enterprise essential functions like our police department and our power plant. We are saying we will come and help you and make sure you do a plan, because if you guys don't have a plan, then no one else downstream can do anything. It's not a policy, but it's just our approach to the program. I think that we've definitely had a number of incidents on campus that have shown the benefit of it, and so that's been a help to us in that our research portfolio is very interested in this because they saw the fire at that facility, and now they recognize that having that would be helpful. And so that's actually been a big driver for departments coming to us, is that they've seen the benefit of it, and we currently don't have a policy requiring it.
A follow-up from Ruth Mitchell, which touches on much of what you just said, but let me see if you want to add anything. She asks, how much and what type of proactive BCP outreach training and awareness do you perform?
So we take whatever advantage we can of opportunities to talk about our business continuity program. Our broader organization, Safety and Risk Services, has 2 annual touch points. We do a risk summit in the spring and then a safety summit in the fall, and we've typically had a 30-minute session about business continuity, and typically we don't talk about really the process of it. We talk about those examples of here's someone here on this campus who's experienced this and how we went through this process. We are looking for inroads to make that happen on the academic side. I think it's a much easier sell to our administrative side. And so, if there are opportunities to go and talk to our academic leadership team about those, we definitely do that. And just try and ask folks, can we come and talk about this particular event or this particular program? So we do try and do that a lot. We will be beefing up that effort in the next couple of months because we're about to launch this new online program. We've been a little bit slow to do it just because right now we can't, if we went out and talked to someone today, they can't actually start it quite yet. But we plan in the next 6 months or so to definitely increase our outreach. And again, look for those opportunities. If you have different groups, like we have a campus communicators group, which is all the communication folks from a bunch of different departments. And so we ask for 15 minutes to go and talk to them about it, and then they can take it back to their departments. So that's kind of been our approach, is how do we find the people who already have existing meetings that's sort of cross-departmental, that we can go and talk about it and hit 12 departments at one time.
Peter McCann again, do you have any success with departments activating their own COOP, or do departments rely on the university to activate their plan?
I think it depends on who it is. The zebrafish example definitely owned their plan and they implemented it. For some of the bigger picture things, typically what happens is when the bad thing happens, we get a call to our incident management team, and then we work hand in hand with the department. And so I think that's just because we have that resource available, and that would just be part of your training process to say, are you telling departments that that they should go ahead and do it, or should they call you, and what your plan is. But for the most part, we're working with them to activate the plans.
And one more thing that I'm wondering about, let me This long comment that just came in from Rushi Kumar, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get to. But Krista, you've mentioned a couple of times how important the business continuity and emergency plans are for PR and for the visibility of the institution. I wonder, do you ever get people saying that you're making it too visible, that you're making it too obvious what things can go wrong sort of by planning for emergencies?
I don't think so. So our approach to that is, for instance, we post the sort of the base of our emergency operations plan on publicly facing websites. What we don't usually post out there are the vulnerability assessment piece. Just because, on one hand, you don't want to kind of give someone the ideas of like, oh, these are the weaknesses here that, someone could exploit. And so what we try and focus on is the personal preparedness, the department preparedness, our response plan, our continuity programs in general, because we're starting to find that we are having parents asking questions now, especially for us after the Umpqua shooting. The number of requests coming in has definitely increased. I've been with our emergency management program for 8 years now, and we used to hear nothing. No one really cared about our stuff, but now it is something that some parents are looking at. They want to know about safety apps, and they want to know about your notification system. And so, having this particular plan can help you say, we are better prepared to get our services up and running to take care of your students because we have this plan. So I think it can actually be a selling point for a campus to say, here's our emergency management program, and we are prepared to respond and recover and implement continuity around any sort of disruption we may have.
Thanks very much, Krista. Thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page for a link to the captioned recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to our speaker slides. The brief evaluation survey I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please do. We read and act on your comments. And mark your calendars for the next Campus Public Safety online webinar, which is being presented at a special day and time, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern Time on Friday, April 21st. Again, that's 11 a.m. to noon Eastern Time on Friday, April 21st. Our topic will be crime prevention through environmental design, and we'll welcome 2 expert speakers, Ed Book, Chief of Police at Santa Fe College, and Ernie Long, Crime Prevention Coordinator for the City of Aventura, Florida. The registration URL is on your screen and clickable, or surf on over to the National Center webpage at nccpsafety.org. That's nccpsafety.org. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety, with support from the University of Vermont Continuing Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Megan O'Neill. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.